Jasmine's hands trembled as she wiped the champagne from her uniform, her eyes locked on the man who had just slapped her across the face. David Hawke, billionaire and untouchable tycoon, smirked as if daring her to fight back. The crowded restaurant froze, the air thick with tension, but no one moved to defend her. Little did David know, this wasn't just an insult, it was the spark that would ignite a storm. Jasmine's life would change forever that night, and so would his. Because when you strike someone with nothing to lose, you'd better be ready for what comes next. Subscribe now. You won't want to miss this powerful story of justice, regret, and life-changing redemption. The restaurant was bustling, its crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow over the polished marble floors. The clink of fine china and low murmur of conversations filled the air, creating a sophisticated ambiance. A place for the city's elite, where the air smelled of rich perfumes and expensive colognes, and the patrons spoke with the confidence only wealth could afford. At a corner table, surrounded by a group of well-dressed business associates, sat David Hawke. A tech mogul in his mid-40s, he radiated power and authority. His tailored suit was impeccable, his expensive watch glinting with every movement. His deep, cold blue eyes scanned the menu as if the decision was beneath him, as if it didn't matter which gourmet dish they would serve. His reputation preceded him: billionaire, ruthless, and arrogant. And then there was Jasmine Reed, a waitress barely in her mid-20s navigating the crowded dining room. Her uniform, a black dress with a white apron, seemed to do little to disguise the strain she felt, both physically and mentally. She'd been working double shifts for weeks now, ever since her father's sudden illness drained her family's savings. Her mother, frail and bedridden, needed expensive medication she couldn't afford. Jasmine was the only one left to carry the weight. She approached the table, her face polite but masked with the exhaustion of a woman caught in a battle far bigger than herself. "Good evening, gentlemen," she greeted softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her mind. Her eyes flickered to David for a brief moment. He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. People like him never did. They didn't see the servers as humans, only as obstacles between them and their next course. She placed the menus down in front of the men, and as she did, she caught David's eyes. He scrutinized her as though he could detect every flaw in her demeanor, her appearance, and her character. "You're new," he remarked in a tone that was neither friendly nor accusatory, just an observation. Jasmine nodded, masking her discomfort. "I've been here for a few weeks, sir." "A few weeks," he repeated, as if savoring the words. His lips twisted into a mock smile. "I should have known. There's a certain look about you." She took a steady breath. "How can I help you tonight?" David raised an eyebrow, as though he didn't believe she had the ability to truly help. "I'll have the sea bass," he said, without even looking at the menu. His voice oozed superiority. "And make sure it's fresh, not like the last time. I don't think I need to remind you how disastrous that was." Jasmine's heart sank, but she kept her composure. She could already feel the eyes of his associates on her, silently judging her, waiting for her to falter. "I'll make sure it's fresh, sir," she replied, her voice calm but tight. But as she turned to leave, she heard him speak again. This time his voice was louder, dripping with condescension. "Tell me, how does a woman like you end up in a place like this? You look a bit out of your depth." The words hit her like a slap, and she forced herself to keep walking. She had learned a long time ago to let insults slide off her like water. But there was something about David's voice, something cruel, that twisted inside her. The kitchen door swung open, and Jasmine paused for a moment to catch her breath. She had heard stories about David Hawke. Rich, famous, an untouchable titan in the business world. He wasn't the first person to treat her this way, but something about him made the anger inside her grow. She grabbed the sea bass order from the kitchen and walked back to the table with a bottle of wine. As she approached, she felt a sense of dread, as if the entire room had shifted, but she couldn't explain why. She set the plate in front of David, her hand shaking ever so slightly. She forced herself to make eye contact, and for a fleeting second, she saw something strange in his eyes, a flash of something darker. As Jasmine placed the wine bottle on the table, David's sharp gaze shifted to her hands. He noticed a slight tremble, and his eyes narrowed. "Careful," he said curtly, his tone cold. "Yes, sir," Jasmine replied, focusing on pouring the wine without spilling a drop. She had been trained for moments like this, to keep calm under scrutiny, but her nerves were fraying under David's intense stare. She finished pouring and moved to place the bottle back in the center of the table. As she did, her hand accidentally brushed against the edge of David's bread plate. It shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but David's reaction was immediate. "Are you serious?" His voice cut through the hum of the restaurant, louder than it needed to be. Heads began to turn. Jasmine blinked, confused. I apologize, sir. Did I—" "You almost knocked over my plate," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you know how much I'm paying to eat here? And you can't even handle a simple task without making a mess?" "I didn't mean to—" she started, her voice trembling. David scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Of course you didn't. That's the problem with people like you. Careless, inattentive, and completely unqualified." Jasmine's cheeks burned. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her. Swallowing her pride, she nodded. "I'll be more careful next time." But David wasn't done. "No," he snapped. "You'll fix it now. Bring me a clean plate, and maybe, just maybe, you'll figure out how to do your job properly." And then, in the next breath, it happened. David's hand shot out like a striking snake, and before Jasmine could process what was happening, the slap landed on her cheek, sharp and unforgiving. The sound echoed through the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air grew thick with tension. Jasmine's head spun, the sting of the slap burning on her skin. She stood frozen for a second, her body in shock, and then slowly, with grace, she took a step back. The room was silent. All eyes were on her. David's associates stared at him, unsure whether to act or speak. His face was red with anger, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and disbelief at what he'd just done. Jasmine's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she wiped her cheek. Her hand trembled, but she didn't make a sound. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply turned and walked away, her mind racing. As she reached the kitchen, she heard the voice of the restaurant manager, Michael, a man who knew better than to cross David. Michael approached her quickly, his face full of concern, but also an unspoken fear. "Jasmine, are you all right?" he asked in a low, cautious tone. She nodded once, too quickly, too controlled. "I'm fine, just need to finish my shift." But Michael saw the tears in her eyes. He knew better than to ask more. He just stood there, his fists clenched, watching her disappear into the back. Out in the dining room, David leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something close to confusion. His associates were speaking in hushed tones, unsure whether to comment on what they had just witnessed. One by one, they shifted their gazes to the door where Jasmine had vanished. David was too wrapped in his own ego to realize what he had done. For a moment, he felt the rush of dominance, the pleasure of putting someone in their place, but the high quickly wore off. He had crossed a line, and deep down, a whisper of doubt started to gnaw at him. He turned to his colleague, a man who had witnessed the whole ordeal, and muttered, "She had it coming." But even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it. The events of that evening spiraled out of David's control faster than he could have imagined. The slap, which he had delivered so swiftly, hung in the air like a cloud waiting to rain. He didn't expect it to have any lasting consequences. After all, he was David Hawk, a billionaire. People feared him. People obeyed him. But what he hadn't counted on was social media. The very next day, a video of the slap was uploaded to various platforms. A bystander, a woman seated a few tables over, had captured the entire scene on her phone. The video showed David's hand striking Jasmine's face, followed by her stunned silence and quick exit from the scene. The clip went viral within hours. The initial comments were filled with outrage. How could a man like him do this? This is unacceptable. But soon, the hashtags began trending. #justice for Jasmine and #Hawk abuse. People were demanding accountability, and the internet, a place that could give a victim a voice louder than any courtroom, had chosen a side. David, meanwhile, woke up to a nightmare. His phone was blowing up with notifications, some from people in the industry, others from complete strangers. A few friends reached out to express their concern, but most simply wanted to distance themselves from the chaos. His lawyer called first thing in the morning, warning him about the viral backlash. "David, this is bad. You need to issue an apology, immediately, before this spirals even further," his lawyer, Ted Mitchell, instructed in a stern, almost panicked tone. David stood by his lavish kitchen island, staring at the screen. He wasn't used to this kind of scrutiny. He was used to being in control, in charge, the one who held the power. The very idea that he had to apologize was revolting. But even he couldn't ignore the tide of public opinion crashing against him. "Fine," David spat. "Tell them I'm sorry. It was a moment of frustration. I'll clear this up." Ted hesitated. "David, you need to understand. This isn't just about the slap. There are people digging into your past. Your employees, the ones who left, they're talking. There's more to this than a simple public relations problem." David's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? What have they found?" Ted sighed, clearly uneasy. "It's not just one mistake, David. There's talk of your business practices, allegations of manipulation, unethical decisions. People are starting to connect the dots. They'll dig up everything. Your reputation could be ruined before the end of the week." David was silent, his mind racing. He had lived his life believing that his wealth could shield him from any consequences. But now, his empire, his reputation, was on the verge of collapse. Jasmine couldn't escape the chaos either. For the first few hours after the slap, she had hoped it was a bad dream, an isolated incident that would be forgotten by morning. But the video spread so fast that she couldn't turn her phone on without seeing herself. The hashtag Justice for Jasmine was everywhere. News outlets began reporting on the incident, some focusing on the slap, others on David's business empire, and a few on Jasmine's personal background. In the privacy of her cramped apartment, Jasmine sat hunched over, her phone buzzing incessantly on the table. She felt sick, her head spinning from the overwhelming flood of messages. The calls were relentless, some people offering support, others offering judgment. And then, there was the note. She had nearly forgotten about it. The small slip of paper passed to her by the mysterious figure at the restaurant, just before she walked away. She had stuffed it into her pocket without thinking, distracted by the sting on her cheek and the rush of emotions. But now, in the quiet solitude of her apartment, she pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. The note was brief, written in hurried handwriting. "He's more than what you think. I know you're angry. He's hurt more people than you can imagine. If you want to know the truth, reach out to me. B." Jasmine read it again. She had no idea who B was, but the cryptic message made her pulse quicken. Her mind raced. Who was this person? And why were they helping her? Jasmine's mind raced, piecing together the note. She had heard rumors about David Hawk before, whispers about shady business dealings and cutthroat tactics, but hearing it from someone who claimed to know more made the fear in her gut deepen. David had made the decision to issue an apology. He sat behind his expansive mahogany desk, his fingers tapping impatiently on the surface as his PR team prepared the statement. His mind kept replaying the slap, the look on Jasmine's face as she left the table, the shock in her eyes. But deep down, he knew he couldn't just issue an apology and make this go away. It was already clear to him that his reputation was on the line, and there was something even more ominous lurking beneath the surface. His assistant, Sarah, entered the room. She was one of the few people he trusted in his company. "David, the press conference is set. Your lawyer is ready." David didn't respond right away, his eyes fixated on the screen in front of him. He scrolled through the news reports, his face darkening with each new revelation. Headlines flashed before his eyes. David Hawk's slap heard around the world, but was this just the tip of the iceberg? Ex-employees speak out against Hawk's alleged abusive business practices. Justice. For Jasmine, who is the waitress that David Hawk just assaulted? David sat back in his chair, clenching his jaw. He couldn't believe it. The fallout was just beginning, and he had no idea how deep it would go. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping out of control. What had started as a routine shift at the restaurant had spiraled into something much bigger. The slap, the viral video, the endless media attention, it all felt like a whirlwind. But as the days passed, something inside her began to shift. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. This was bigger than her. She had been handed an opportunity to bring David Hawk down. The message from B had kept her awake at night. Who was this person? And why had they reached out to her? It seemed too coincidental to ignore. Jasmine wasn't one to believe in fate or destiny, but she couldn't help but wonder if there was some larger force at play. She wasn't alone in this fight. She sat at her small dining table, scrolling through her phone, reading more about the fallout. Every article seemed to delve deeper into David's past. The headlines were getting more vicious, more personal. His business practices, the way he treated employees, his questionable financial dealings, it was all coming to light. People were beginning to paint him as a villain, and with each new revelation, Jasmine's resolve strengthened. But still, there was the question of B. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The phone call from earlier had left her with more questions than answers. She had to know more, and if she could find out the truth, she could use it. She couldn't just be a victim in this story. She had to take control. That afternoon, she reached out to Ben, the man who claimed to know the full extent of David's dark side. She dialed the number he had given her heart racing as she waited for him to pick up. "Jasmine," his voice came through, calm and steady. "Did you get my message?" "I did," she said, her voice tight with uncertainty. "But I need to know more. You said you know things about David, things that could help me." Ben paused for a moment, his voice lowering. "You need to be careful. This isn't just about you. He's hurt a lot of people, more than you can imagine. He's built his empire on the backs of those he's crushed along the way. But if you're serious about this, about making him pay, you'll have to take the risk." Jasmine's hand tightened around her phone. "I don't care. I want to know everything." "All right," Ben said. "But you need to understand, this is going to get ugly. David's not just a businessman. He's got a lot of influence, a lot of powerful people behind him. You've seen what happened after the slap, right? This is just the tip of the iceberg. I'll meet you tomorrow. There's something you need to see." Meanwhile, David's world was rapidly falling apart. The press conference he had been forced into was nothing short of a disaster. His carefully crafted apology, written by his PR team, seemed hollow and insincere to the public. No matter how many times he claimed it was a momentary lapse of judgment, people weren't buying it. His social media feeds were flooded with anger, and his lawyer, Ted, had been working overtime to try and mitigate the damage. But there was a problem neither of them had anticipated: Jasmine. Every time they tried to release a new statement or cover up his past mistakes, the internet, the media, the very public he had once dominated, turned on him even more. Jasmine had become a symbol. She was no longer just a waitress in his eyes. She was a force, one he hadn't anticipated. David's assistant, Sarah, entered his office again, looking pale, her hands shaking as she handed him the latest news article. "David, you need to see this," she said, voice trembling. "It's not just the slap. People are digging into your business dealings. There's a former employee speaking out." David grabbed the article and scanned it quickly. It was about a former business partner who had worked with him in the early days of his company. The man was now claiming that David had not only stolen ideas, but had used unethical means to bankrupt competitors. The accusations were damning, but the worst part was that it was all coming from someone who had once been a close ally. "This is insane," David muttered, slamming the paper down on the desk. "They're trying to destroy me." Ted Mitchell, standing across from him, shook his head. "This is bigger than just a slap, David. If these allegations go public, if they tie this into what's already happened, it's game over. You need to do something." David's mind raced. He had built everything he had from the ground up, and now it felt like it was all slipping through his fingers. "This can't be happening. I've worked too hard. I'm not going down like this." Ted leaned in, his voice low. "There's one option left. You need to find Jasmine. Control the narrative before it's too late." David's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Ted paused for a moment. "Find her. Pay her off. Do whatever it takes. Get her to retract the story. If we can get her out of the spotlight, this will die down." David stared at him for a moment, considering the suggestion. But as he thought about it, something dark flickered behind his eyes. Jasmine had humiliated him in front of the world, and the idea of her walking away unscathed, untouched, was unbearable. "If she thinks she can ruin me, she's got another thing coming," David muttered, his voice cold. The next day, Jasmine met Ben in a quiet, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. She had no idea who he was, only that he claimed to know everything about David and that he was the key to taking him down. Ben was waiting for her at a corner table, his face shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. "Jasmine," he greeted her as she approached. His voice was familiar, but his appearance was nondescript, as though he wanted to blend into the background. "You came." "I had to," she replied, sitting down across from him. "Tell me what you know." Ben glanced around, making sure no one was listening before leaning in. David's business is built on manipulation, lies, and dirty tactics. But there's one thing he's terrified of: his past. There's something he's been hiding for years, something that could end him. If you're serious about exposing him, this is your chance. Jasmine's heart raced. "What is it?" Ben smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "You've got the key, Jasmine. It's time to turn it." David was preparing for what he thought would be his last resort. Find Jasmine, control the situation. His lawyer had provided him with a list of potential methods: subtle intimidation, threats, even financial offers. But David was no longer thinking clearly. His mind was clouded with rage and fear. The storm was coming, and neither of them was prepared for the destruction it would leave in its wake. Jasmine left the cafe with more questions than answers, her mind buzzing with the weight of the conversation. Ben's cryptic words rattled in her head. "You've got the key, Jasmine. It's time to turn it." But what did that mean? What was she supposed to do with the information he claimed to have? Her heart beat faster as she realized that whatever she decided next could determine her future. In the days that followed, Jasmine's life became a blur of phone calls, meetings, and sleepless nights. She couldn't focus on anything else. The haunting image of David's hand striking her face, the way he had towered over her like she was nothing, played on an endless loop in her mind. She needed to do more than just get justice for herself. She had to expose him for who he truly was. The more Jasmine dug, the more she uncovered. She went through her old contacts from her brief time working for David at the restaurant. One of the former employees, a waitress who had worked there years ago, agreed to meet her. This woman, Lily, was now out of the business, but had witnessed some of the darker sides of David's character. Over coffee, Lily shared her stories: how David had manipulated staff, how he treated his employees like disposable objects, and how his temper flared at the smallest provocation. "Listen, Jasmine," Lily said, lowering her voice. "This is more than just him being a rich, entitled jerk. He's dangerous. He's got connections that go deep. I'm telling you, don't underestimate him." Jasmine nodded, her mind racing. This was the confirmation she needed. There was something bigger at play. It wasn't just about a woman being slapped in a restaurant. It was about the years of abuse, the manipulation, the exploitation. David had built his empire on a foundation of lies and crushed lives. But Jasmine still didn't have the full picture. Ben had promised her the missing piece. He had to know something that could destroy David. David's world, on the other hand, was unraveling even faster than he anticipated. Despite the damage control from his PR team, the accusations continued to pile up. The viral video was only the beginning. His lawyer had already warned him that they couldn't stop the storm now. Jasmine had become the symbol of everything that was wrong with David's empire. David's desperation led him to make a decision he never thought he would. He would take matters into his own hands. If he could control Jasmine, make her retract her story, maybe, just maybe, he could save himself. His wealth and power had always shielded him from consequences, but now he was fighting for his legacy. He had his private investigator look into her background, combing through her social media accounts, tracking down anyone who might know her. David needed to find out where she was staying, who her friends were, and how to approach her without alarming her. He wasn't about to let someone like Jasmine destroy everything he had worked for. His office was filled with the hushed voices of his inner circle, all giving their opinions. But David was fixed on one thing. He needed Jasmine to fall in line. "You need to be careful, David," his private investigator Michael said one evening after giving a report. "She's not backing down. And I've heard rumors. She's meeting with people. Someone's feeding her information about your past. She might be more dangerous than you think." David leaned forward, his fingers tapping the desk impatiently. "I don't care who's helping her. I'll pay her off, intimidate her, whatever it takes. I need her to stop. Now." Michael's face darkened. "You should be careful with that approach. If you push too hard, she could turn the tables on you. This isn't just a business deal. This is personal for her." David ignored the warning. He wasn't used to losing, and he wasn't about to start now. "Find her. Get me to her. I'll handle it." Days turned into weeks, and Jasmine was no closer to figuring out how to bring David down. She continued meeting with Ben, piecing together bits of information he had given her. But nothing was as concrete as she wanted it to be. She needed something tangible, something that would shake the foundations of David's empire. Then one night, everything changed. She received an unexpected message from Ben. It was late, and Jasmine had just returned from her shift at the bar. She sat down at her kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the message. "Meet me, tomorrow, 10 a.m. I have something for you." There was no subject, no elaboration, just a location, a parking garage, an address. Jasmine's gut told her to be cautious. She didn't trust Ben fully, but she couldn't deny that he had information she needed. So, against her better judgment, she agreed. The next morning, she arrived at the location, a nondescript, dimly lit parking structure on the edge of town. She hesitated for a moment, her hand on the door handle. This could be a trap, but Jasmine was past caring. The adrenaline coursing through her veins pushed her forward. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As she walked deeper into the garage, she spotted Ben standing by a beat-up car, his expression unreadable. He nodded as she approached. "You came," he said simply. "I did," Jasmine replied. "Now, what do you have for me?" Ben pulled a thick folder from the car and handed it to her. "This is everything. The full truth about David Hawk. His business dealings, his connections, the people he's hurt. This is your weapon." Jasmine's fingers shook as she opened the folder. Inside, she found documents, photos, and testimonies, things she had never imagined. The truth was more disturbing than she had anticipated. David wasn't just a businessman with a short temper. He had destroyed entire companies, ruined lives, and manipulated people for years. The evidence in front of her was damning. She had the power to destroy him. But there was one last piece of the puzzle. "I will tell you when next we meet," B said. Jasmine's heart raced. She was finally getting closer to the truth that could end David's reign once and for all. As Jasmine delved deeper into David's past, the walls around him continued to close in. He had made an enemy out of someone who was now systematically picking apart everything he had built. But he still had a final weapon: his wealth. Money could solve everything, he thought. He could buy off anyone, silence any threat. But this time, money wasn't enough. David sat at his desk, his hands clenched in frustration. He knew Jasmine was out there, gathering information, piecing together his fall from grace. And every day that passed, he grew more desperate. He had to stop her. The only question was, how? Jasmine sat alone in her apartment, the folder containing the evidence from Ben spread out on the table in front of her. The weight of it all was almost suffocating. She had spent hours combing through the documents, each page more damning than the last. David Hawk's empire wasn't just built on manipulation and deceit, it was built on ruin. There were stories of workers who had been forced out of their jobs without pay, families who had lost everything because of David's ruthless business practices. And then, there were the people who had mysteriously disappeared after crossing him. Jasmine's stomach churned as she read the testimonies, but she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person David had ever hurt. This was about exposing him for the monster he truly was. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ben. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to discuss how to take him down for good." Her heart raced. She knew this was it. She had the ammunition to bring him down, but she couldn't do it alone. Ben had been a crucial part of this journey, and now she needed him more than ever. David had never been this close to losing everything. His empire, his reputation, everything he had worked for was on the verge of collapse. He had spent the last few days meeting with his top advisors, trying to find a way out of the mess he was in. His lawyer, Ted, was the only one still speaking with any confidence. "David, we need to move fast," Ted said, pacing back and forth in front of David's desk. "This information Jasmine has, it's damaging. The media is picking up on it, and if they get their hands on the rest of it, it's game over. We need to contain this before it spirals any further." David gritted his teeth. "I know, Ted, I know. I've already made a move. I'm getting closer to her. I'll stop this, one way or another." Ted stopped in his tracks, looking at David with a mixture of caution and disbelief. "Are you sure you want to go this route? I know you're desperate, but if you push her too far, if you threaten her or try to silence her, it could make everything worse. The public's already turned on you. You'll be the villain for life." David's eyes darkened. "I don't care. She's the one making this personal, and now I'm going to make her regret it. I'll do whatever it takes to protect everything I've built." The next day, Jasmine met Ben at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The place was empty, its silence almost suffocating. As soon as she walked in, she saw him standing near the back, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. "You made it," Ben said, his tone a mix of relief and urgency. "We don't have much time. David's not backing down. He's getting more aggressive. You have to move quickly, or everything you've worked for will slip away." Jasmine nodded, her face grim. "I'm ready. I've got everything I need. The documents, the testimonies, it's all there. But what now? How do we bring him down?" Ben's eyes flickered with a dark intensity. "We go public. We make sure the right people see what's in those files. We can't let him hide behind his money and influence anymore. But there's one more thing. You need to meet with someone who can help you get the final nail in his coffin." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Ben hesitated before speaking. "Someone who's worked closely with David. Someone who knows the ins and outs of his operations. Someone who can corroborate everything you've uncovered. Her name's Evelyn. She used to work for David's company. She's scared, but if you convince her, she'll testify against him." Jasmine's stomach tightened. "How do I convince her?" Ben looked at her, his expression serious. "By showing her that you're not afraid. If you go in there weak, she'll turn you away. But if you show her that you're determined, that you're in this for the long haul, she'll help. She's the key, Jasmine. She's the one who can push this over the edge." David's mind was consumed by the idea of Jasmine bringing him down. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let her expose him for the monster he knew he could be. He had a final plan in mind, a plan to make Jasmine regret ever crossing him. He called in his trusted private investigator, Michael, once again. "Where is she?" David demanded. "I need to know where she is, where she's meeting with people." Michael hesitated before answering. "She's meeting someone tomorrow. I don't know who, but it looks like she's trying to get more information. She's not backing down." David's hand clenched into a fist. "Then we'll just have to put an end to it." Michael looked concerned. "David, I've been telling you, this isn't something you can fix with money or threats. Jasmine's determined, and if you go after her too hard, it'll backfire. You're already losing control of the narrative." David's eyes blazed with fury. "I don't care. Get me everything I need. I'm going to make sure she regrets ever thinking she could take me down." The following day, Jasmine drove to a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, her nerves on edge. She had tracked down Evelyn, the woman Ben had mentioned, and arranged to meet her in person. Evelyn had agreed to meet under one condition. Jasmine had to promise that she would help her if things went south. Jasmine walked into the cafe, scanning the room for the woman she was supposed to meet. It didn't take long for her to spot Evelyn, an older woman with tired eyes and a nervous demeanor. She was sitting alone at a corner table, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her coffee cup. "Evelyn?" Jasmine asked softly as she approached. Evelyn looked up, startled at first, but then nodded. "You're Jasmine, right? I I wasn't sure if you'd really show up. Jasmine sat down across from her, keeping her voice steady. I'm here. I need your help, Evelyn. You worked with David Hawk. You know what he's capable of. I need you to help me expose him. Evelyn's eyes darted nervously around the cafe and she lowered her voice. You don't know what you're asking. David, he's dangerous. He'll stop at nothing to protect himself. I've seen what he can do to people who cross him. I can't get involved. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice firm. Evelyn, I understand your fear. But if we don't do something now, he'll keep getting away with it. You're not the only one he's hurt. If you help me, we can take him down for good. For everyone he's destroyed. Evelyn hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. I've lost everything because of him. My job, my dignity, my family. He's destroyed so many lives. I can't let him get away with it. I'll help you, Jasmine. I'll tell you everything I know. David's final move was already in motion. He had sent his best people to follow Jasmine. He knew she would eventually find her way to Evelyn. The only question was whether Jasmine would be able to withstand the pressure he was about to put on her. He had a plan that would make her regret everything. Jasmine could feel the walls closing in around her. The calm before the storm had passed, and now the real fight was about to begin. With Evelyn's testimony in hand and the damning evidence she had compiled, Jasmine knew she had the power to expose David Hawk. But she also knew that this wasn't just about getting the truth out. It was about surviving long enough to make sure it reached the right people. She and Evelyn had spent hours together over the past few days, preparing. Evelyn had agreed to give her a detailed account of everything she knew about David's shady business dealings, his threats, and how he'd manipulated people for years. But even with the truth, Jasmine wasn't naive enough to think this would be an easy battle. David had resources, connections, and a ruthless streak that could destroy anyone who crossed him. Jasmine sat in her small apartment, her mind racing as she reviewed everything one last time. She glanced at the folder on her desk, filled with testimonies, photos, and contracts. It was a mountain of evidence, but without Evelyn's story, it wouldn't be enough. Evelyn was the key to proving David's cruelty, to showing the world just how far he was willing to go to protect his empire. I'm doing the right thing, Jasmine whispered to herself, trying to steady her nerves. But the weight of what she was about to do threatened to overwhelm her. She knew this wasn't just about taking down a powerful man. It was about risking everything to bring justice to those who had suffered in silence for too long. David had been receiving messages from his contacts, warning him that Jasmine was planning something big. But David didn't take those warnings seriously. He had too many people in his pocket, too many ways to control the narrative. He was convinced that no matter what, he would come out on top. That's when he received a message from his private investigator, Michael. Jasmine's got Evelyn. She's planning to go public with her testimony. David's heart skipped a beat. Evelyn was the one person who knew everything. Everything about his dealings, the lies, the cover-ups, the people he'd destroyed. If Evelyn spoke out, it would be the end of everything. David clenched his jaw and paced the length of his penthouse. He had to act fast. He couldn't let Jasmine win. He couldn't let Evelyn destroy him. Jasmine knew David wouldn't go down without a fight. He was too powerful, too well-connected. That's why she had to move fast. She couldn't wait for the legal system to catch up to him. She had to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to a few trusted contacts, people she knew would help her get the evidence into the right hands. There was Karen, an investigative journalist who had been following David's rise for years. She had always suspected something was off about his business practices, but never had the proof to back it up. And then there was Isaac, a lawyer who had helped Jasmine in the past, and who was now ready to help her fight back against David's army of lawyers. Together, they crafted a plan. The goal was to make sure the public couldn't ignore the truth. They would release the evidence to a handful of top news outlets and make sure Evelyn's testimony was included in the public record. It was a calculated move. Jasmine knew the moment she went public, David would try to destroy her. But she had to take that risk. It was the only way. But there was one more step. Jasmine needed to confront David directly. She needed to make him see that no matter what he did, she was not afraid of him anymore. He had tried to control her, intimidate her, humiliate her. Now, it was her turn to take control. She had arranged to meet him in a private office. a neutral location where he couldn't use his wealth and power to manipulate the situation. She would bring the evidence with her, everything that proved he was a fraud. When she walked into that room, Jasmine knew there would be no turning back. David had been preparing for this moment for days. He had his team ready, a group of security guards stationed outside the meeting location. He knew Jasmine was coming to confront him, and he wasn't going to let her humiliate him publicly. If she had the evidence, he could use his influence to silence her. He had already made his final move, a massive legal team ready to discredit every single thing Jasmine and Evelyn had claimed. He would tear apart their testimonies, find flaws in their stories, and paint them as nothing more than bitter individuals trying to tear him down out of spite. The press would eat it up, and he would come out the other side looking like the victim. But deep down, David knew something was different about Jasmine. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid of him, and that terrified him. When Jasmine walked into the meeting room, David was sitting at the head of the table, his face cold and unreadable. He didn't even look up as she entered. "Jasmine," he said flatly, his voice laced with disdain. "I was wondering when you would finally show up. What's this about? You think you can take me down with a bunch of lies and accusations?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She placed the folder on the table between them and slid it toward him. "You've been lying to everyone, David, for years. And now, the truth is coming out. It's time for you to face the consequences." David stared at the folder, his face turning pale. He could feel the walls closing in. He had underestimated Jasmine. "You can't do this," David sneered. "You think people will believe you? I've got more money, more influence than you could ever dream of. You're nothing." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice steady but fierce. "You're wrong. I'm not nothing. I'm someone who's been through hell because of you. And now, I'm going to make sure the world knows who you really are." David's hands clenched into fists. He was furious, but he knew she was right. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late to stop her. The days following Jasmine's confrontation with David were nothing short of chaotic. The news spread like wildfire. Every major outlet was reporting on the allegations against David Hawk, his corruption, and the empire he had built on lies and manipulation. Jasmine had done what seemed impossible. She had exposed one of the most powerful men in the business world. But as the media firestorm raged, David fought back with a fury no one had expected. He had always been one step ahead of everyone, and now he was pulling every string he could find to salvage his reputation and his company. In a public statement, David's PR team released a carefully crafted response, trying to paint him as the victim of a smear campaign. They called Jasmine's allegations baseless and accused her of fabricating stories to bring him down. The media ate it up. David had the money and influence to turn the tide, and he wasn't about to let a little thing like the truth stand in his way. Behind the scenes, David went into overdrive. His lawyers were working around the clock to discredit Evelyn's testimony and the evidence Jasmine had provided. The plan was simple: make Jasmine and Evelyn appear unreliable, desperate for attention, and motivated by personal vendettas. He was pulling every card in the deck to save his empire. David's desperation grew with each passing hour. He had already lost a significant amount of support among his investors and business partners, and the stock price of his company had plummeted. Now, with Evelyn's testimony on the verge of going public, he had no choice but to double down. His next move was darker than anyone anticipated. Jasmine watched from the sidelines as David's team mounted their defense, but she refused to back down. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let him destroy her. Still, the weight of everything that was happening was starting to bear down on her. The constant media attention, the threats she'd been receiving, and the growing tension with her loved ones. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It had become a fight for survival. She was no stranger to adversity, but even she felt the strain. The calls had started coming in, the anonymous ones. First, it was just a few warning her to stop, to back off. But now, they were threatening her directly. They knew her schedule, her habits. Jasmine couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that someone was watching her, that David's power had reached deeper into her life than she'd ever anticipated. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Then, there was Ben. He had been a rock through all of this, but lately, he seemed distant. His messages had become fewer, and he wasn't picking up the phone when she called. Jasmine felt the sharp sting of betrayal, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Was Ben losing faith, or was he simply too afraid of David's reach? Jasmine decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to a handful of influential allies who had supported her from the start, determined to see this through to the end. The stakes were too high for her to back down now. It wasn't just about her reputation, or even David's downfall. It was about doing the right thing, about giving a voice to those who had suffered in silence. She scheduled a meeting with Karen, the journalist who had agreed to help her expose David. Karen had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, getting ready to publish the full story, but Jasmine knew they needed more than just a headline. They needed a full-fledged expose. She was determined to push it forward. However, when Jasmine arrived at the coffee shop for their meeting, she found the place eerily empty. Karen hadn't arrived yet. Jasmine felt a shiver run down her spine as she checked the time. She was early, so she waited. Minutes ticked by, then hours. She tried calling Karen, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in. Jasmine's phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "You've gone too far, Jasmine. This ends now." Jasmine's heart raced as the weight of the threat sank in. Was this David's doing, or was it something more sinister? She had no way of knowing, but one thing was clear: she was running out of time. Back at his penthouse, David was fuming. His PR team was doing everything they could, but the situation was spiraling out of control. He couldn't let this happen. Not now. Not when he was so close to regaining control. David received a call from Michael, his private investigator. The news wasn't good. "Jasmine is on to us. She's going public with everything and there's no stopping her. She's meeting with someone right now, most likely that journalist, Karen." David's eyes narrowed, his mind calculating the next move. If Jasmine went public with the full story, it would be catastrophic. But there was something even worse. Evelyn's testimony was too strong. If it got into the wrong hands, it would expose everything. "Do whatever it takes," David growled into the phone. "I don't care how you do it. Shut them up. Now." By the time Jasmine left the coffee shop, she knew something was horribly wrong. She could feel it. She wasn't alone. Her every step seemed to echo in the empty street. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them. Two men, emerging from the shadows, walking toward her. Her pulse quickened. She recognized one of them. Michael, the man who had been tailing her for days. "Jasmine," he called out, his voice dripping with cold menace. "You should have known better than to get involved in something you don't understand." Jasmine stopped in her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you want from me?" Michael's lips curled into a sinister smile. "We just want to make sure you don't make a bigger mistake, Jasmine. You think you can take down David Hawk? You don't know who you're dealing with." Jasmine took a step back, trying to keep her composure. "You can't intimidate me. It's over. People know the truth. David can't stop this." Michael's expression darkened. "We'll see about that." Before Jasmine could react, one of the men lunged toward her, grabbing her arm and yanking her back. Panic surged through her as she struggled to break free. But then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, vanishing into the shadows. Jasmine's heart raced as she stumbled back, breathless. She had narrowly escaped, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into a game she didn't understand. The trap was closing. As the stakes continued to rise, Jasmine realized just how far David was willing to go to protect himself. His threats were no longer subtle. He wasn't playing by the rules anymore. Jasmine was in the fight of her life, and she knew that every moment brought her closer to an inevitable clash. The final days before the full reveal felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Jasmine had come too far to back out now, but with every passing moment, the danger to her grew more real. David's efforts to discredit her were reaching a fever pitch, and his grip on his empire was slipping. The news was filled with reports of his increasingly erratic behavior, investors pulling out, and whispers of a scandal that could ruin everything he had built. But Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person David had ever trampled on. For Evelyn, for the countless victims of his abuse, and for the justice that had been long overdue. This final showdown wasn't just about taking down a powerful man. It was about making sure his reign of terror came to a crushing end. Jasmine's phone buzzed in her hand. It was an encrypted message from Karen, the journalist who had been helping her every step of the way. "It's time. The story's going live tomorrow. We're going to take him down." Jasmine stared at the message, her heart racing. Tomorrow. It was happening. The plan was set. Karen would publish the full exposé, complete with Evelyn's testimony and every shred of evidence Jasmine had gathered. There would be no turning back. Once the story hit the public, David's empire would come crashing down, and he would have no way to silence the truth. That night, Jasmine couldn't sleep. The weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on her chest. She tried to prepare herself for the fallout, for the legal battles that would follow, for the personal toll it would take on her. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when her phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" she said, her voice tense. A familiar voice, low and menacing, came through the line. "You think you've won, Jasmine? You think you can destroy me? You don't know what you're dealing with. The truth isn't going to save you." It was David. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, but she steadied her breath. "This ends tomorrow, David. You can't control this anymore. People are going to know who you really are." David's laugh on the other end of the line was chilling. "You think your little exposé is going to stop me? You think I'm scared of your pathetic little evidence?" Jasmine's grip tightened around the phone. "You should be. This time, you don't have an escape." There was a long silence. And then, in a voice colder than ever, David said, "We'll see about that." The call ended abruptly. Jasmine sat frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her mind. She knew that David wasn't going to let this go quietly. Whatever he had planned, it would come soon. The following morning was a blur. Jasmine had arranged to meet at the office to go over their final preparations before the story went live. She was about to head out the door when her phone rang again, this time with an untraceable number. It was a single message, a photo. The image was of her apartment building, taken from the street below. It was clear that someone had been watching her. She immediately felt her blood run cold. As she frantically scanned the message for any other clues, her phone vibrated with another call. This time, it was Karen. "Jasmine, we've got a problem," Karen said, urgency in her voice. "I've been contacted by someone close to David. They've made threats against you. They know everything about you." Jasmine's stomach twisted into knots. "What do you mean, everything?" "They know your routine, where you live, where you go. They know everything." Jasmine's heart raced. "We can't stop now, Karen. The story goes live today. We can't back out." "I agree," Karen said, but there was a note of worry in her voice. "But I need you to be careful. David's not going to take this lying down." The call ended abruptly, and Jasmine found herself standing in the middle of her apartment, every instinct screaming at her to leave, to disappear, to get out of harm's way. But there was no time. She had to finish this. Just as Jasmine was about to leave for the meeting, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitant, she peered through the peephole. There was no one there. Confused, she opened the door, only to find a manila envelope lying on the ground. She bent down and picked it up. No return address. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It was a picture of Evelyn, tied up, bruised, and barely conscious. The message was written in bold, capitalized letters. "If you don't stop, this is what will happen to you and everyone you care about." Jasmine's blood turned to ice as she stared at the photograph. Evelyn. She couldn't even begin to process the image in front of her. Was this David's doing? Was it his way of warning her, of trying to force her into submission? In a panic, she called Isaac, her lawyer, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her mind raced, trying to figure out her next move. But there was no time to hesitate. Evelyn's life was on the line. Just as Jasmine was about to make a move, she received another message. This time, it wasn't from David or anyone connected to him. It was from someone unexpected, Ben. "I know you're scared. I know what you're thinking, but you don't have to do this alone. Meet me at the old warehouse by the docks. It's time to end this. Jasmine's heart fluttered. Could it be that Ben had come to his senses, realizing what was at stake? Or was this another trap? She didn't have time to second-guess herself. She grabbed her things and left her apartment, heading straight to the docks. The location was deserted, dark and empty. But then, she saw him. Ben stood there, waiting by the abandoned warehouse. "What's going on, Ben? What do you want?" Jasmine demanded, her voice shaky but firm. Ben's face was a mask of tension. "I've been trying to protect you, Jasmine, all along, but you need to stop. You can't take David down. Not like this." Jasmine's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" Ben's next words were a gut punch. "I've been working for David all along, Jasmine. I was trying to keep you safe from the fallout, but it's too late. The story's already out there, and I can't protect you anymore." Jasmine felt her world crumble beneath her feet. "What? You've been lying to me?" Ben's eyes filled with regret. "I never meant for it to go this far, but I'm too deep in. It's too late for both of us now." Jasmine stood there, stunned, as the realization sank in. Ben had been part of the system that she had been fighting against. He had been playing both sides, and now he had nothing left to offer. The truth was, Jasmine had always been alone in this fight, but she wasn't backing down. Not now. Jasmine stepped forward, determined. "I don't need your protection, Ben. I don't need anyone to fight this battle for me. I've already won." Ben didn't say a word as he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the shadows. The battle wasn't over, but Jasmine knew one thing for sure. This time, David Hawk wouldn't be able to escape. The aftermath of the scandal was swift and brutal. David's empire collapsed. The once untouchable mogul was arrested on multiple charges, his assets seized, and his influence shattered. The public reacted in shock and anger, with many wondering how they had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. As for Jasmine, she became a symbol of courage and resilience. Her life would never be the same, but she had won. The truth had come out, and no one, especially David, could take that away from her. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Jasmine knew one thing: justice had finally been served. Thank you for making it to the end of this story. The next chapter of adventure and intrigue awaits. Click the video to the left to keep the excitement going. Hit subscribe, and let's share more stories together. See you soon.